Hey everyone, happy Friday. We have a shorter video this week because I was busy posting my first video back on the main channel after a long absence. This week we have an edition full of trade news with what the EU can do against American tariffs and why Trump is so much after Ireland, as well as many other news stories linked to EU deregulation in our weekly brief. Donald Trump has launched a trade war against the world, and now the EU is looking to deal with the fallout. Along with 60 countries, the EU has been singled out as a worst offender for higher rates because of its trade surplus with the United States. And the bloc now faces a 20% tariff on all exports to the US. European Commission President von der Leyen vowed to retaliate, saying the EU was prepared to respond. So can and should Europe actually hit back at the US? Well, the EU has previously announced counter-tariffs to his previous steel tariffs on goods like motorcycles and bourbon, worth 26 billion euros. But in some strategic sectors, the US is so dominant and the EU so dependent that it risks shooting itself in the foot if it retaliates. That's because European countries rely significantly on the US in three key areas. First, defense. European countries depend heavily on American weapons. European NATO countries buy 64% of their military equipment in the US. In tech, US companies power Europe's digital infrastructure. European businesses and governments rely on software from American multinationals like Microsoft, Amazon, or Google. And in energy, US LNG imports now make up 45% of EU total imports, replacing Russian gas. US technology also supports European energy production. And the thing is, these ties are more than convenience. They're strategic lifelines and leverage in a trade war. European countermeasures could backfire on European industries that depend on the US. Generally, the US relies less on the EU than the other way around. While the EU is the US's biggest trading partner, as the economist Daniel Kai points out, European countries are much more dependent on exporting to the US than the other way around. But the EU does hold one major trump card. It exports medicines, pharmaceutical products, and chemicals that the US can't replace easily due to limited supply and dependency in the short term. In fact, Trump's tariffs have expressly spared pharmaceuticals, though he has plans to address this dependency in the future. But so with limited leverage of its own, the EU is looking to reduce its own dependence on the US. While the EU is looking to strengthen its defense industry, promote digital sovereignty, and energy independence, these are not things that it can easily do in the short term. And that's why the EU will likely not be able to retaliate effectively against the United States, and will have to either accept a degree of tariffs from the US or make some significant trade concessions. Trump's tariffs will hit the entire EU economy, but one country will suffer the most: Ireland. With a €15 billion trade deficit, Trump is taking aim at some of its biggest sectors. So why will Ireland be hit so hard by Trump's trade war? Well, Ireland's growth model has been being a base of operations for US companies. Low tax rates have attracted many American companies, particularly those in the pharmaceutical products, chemicals, and medical device sectors. American companies put their intellectual property and manufacturing in Ireland, leading to a large import of services from the United States. This in turn allowed Ireland to profit from increased tax revenue from being a corporate base for American companies, while US companies paid out dividends from Ireland at lower tax rates. As a result, in 2024, exports of medical and pharmaceutical products reached 80 billion euros. Ireland has deepened its reliance on the US in the last decade, with exports surging 34% last year. While the Irish pharmaceutical industry avoided Liberation Day tariffs, many feel that the country is operating on borrowed time and that the US will soon come knocking. In fact, Donald Trump has mentioned several times his obsession with Ireland's pharmaceutical industry, saying that the country had it in its grasp. Trump's end goal is to raise costs for companies so high that they will move production back to the US. And that's a problem for Ireland, considering that about 12% of Irish GDP in the pharmaceutical sector could be subject to American tariffs, far higher than the next most affected country in the EU, Belgium, at just 4%. That's why Ireland's finance department and ESRI think tank estimates that Trump's tariffs could cost Ireland more than 18 billion euros in lost trade, more than 3% of its GDP. With so much of its economy dependent on US exports and American corporations, Ireland's greatest economic strength could quickly turn into its Achilles heel. And now for our weekly brief. In sustainability news, the European Parliament voted to delay reporting rules for companies on their negative impact on pollution and human rights until 2028. EU institutions will now discuss simplifying the rules and making them mandatory only for large companies. In more policy news, it seems like Europe's signature privacy law, the GDPR, is headed to the scrapper. The EU is looking to scrap bureaucracy and red tape in its effort to shore up competitiveness. The GDPR, which introduced a lot of friction for online businesses, limited innovation, and had us waste 575 million hours a year to approve cookies, looks to be soon over. In armament news, despite EU efforts to reduce dependencies on American weapons, Poland signed a $2 billion air defense deal and Bulgaria purchased anti-tank missiles. The US supplied 64% of European NATO members' military purchases in the past 5 years, but in a sign of change, the US is objecting to European plans to buy more weapons locally. In more armament news, the EU is shifting its $392 billion regional funds to support defense and strategic sectors. The funds make up almost 1/3 of the EU's budget and are meant to boost growth in underdeveloped regions. Now countries can also use the money for large companies in defense, strategic sectors, and decarbonization. The European Commission presented plans to combat threats like terrorism and organized crime. It proposes giving law enforcement more access to data and strengthening agencies like Europol and Frontex. The Commission will evaluate whether law enforcement authorities can also access encrypted data in the future. In space news, the first orbital rocket launched from mainland Europe crashed shortly after liftoff in Norway. The German startup ISR Aerospace said that the test provided valuable data for future satellite launches. In diplomacy news, US embassies have sent letters to European companies demanding that they halt their diversity policies or risk losing contracts with the US government. Officials in France and Belgium hit back against what they see as American interference. In industry news, British Steel will close the UK's only 2 remaining blast furnaces, citing financial struggles from market conditions, tariffs, and high environmental costs. The closure ends UK raw steel production, and the company that owned it had been Chinese since 2020. Estonia's parliament changed its constitution to prohibit non-EU citizens from voting in local elections. Estonia previously allowed stateless residents, chiefly Russians and Belarusians, to vote in local elections. Prompted by security concerns amid Russia's war in Ukraine, from October 2025, non-EU citizens will no longer be allowed to vote. Estonia's Prime Minister, Kristen Michal, hailed it as a triumph for national sovereignty. In Islam news, at a cross-party meeting, French politicians and ministers from both left and right united to defend Republican values and oppose Islamism. Interior Minister Bruno Retailleau called Islamism a poison and the only separation threatening the Republic. Meanwhile, the French Prime Minister announced in a statement that there were 9 million Muslims in France. This puts the population of Muslims at 14%, much higher than the official statistics, which up until now had put the Muslim population of France at roughly 10%. That was it for this week. Like I said, this video was quite a bit shorter since I released a video on the main channel about Marine Le Pen being banned from elections, which took up most of my time earlier this week and would have otherwise been a topic for this video. If that's something you find interesting, then go check it out now. And make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you next week.